President Biden is set to visit Buffalo, New York, following the deadly mass shooting at Tops Friendly Market. The trip comes 3 days after a white gunman opened fire in the predominantly black neighborhood and community store.
Peyton Gendron, the 18-year-old alleged suspect, told authorities he was targeting the black community following his arrest. Now, after the shooting, a document allegedly tied to the gunman emerged online. The so-called manifesto includes racist, anti-immigrant views and cites the Great Replacement theory.
U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the Justice Department is investigating the attack as a, quote, hate crime and an act of racially motivated violent extremism.
Which it seems pretty clear that it is. I've been somewhat critical of hate crime designations a little bit in the past. I think the way that they're tallied is somewhat, if you look at it, so reporting hate crimes to the FBI is a voluntary thing. Police departments are not obligated to do it. But over the years, more and more local municipalities do send hate crime data. So it can actually look like hate crimes are getting worse year over year, solely because of changes in the reporting and who's doing reporting. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. This should clearly be investigated as a hate crime, I suppose. Yeah. Although it's murder regardless. So it should not, he should get whatever the maximum penalty for murder, or if there are mitigating factors, whatever. But the animating sort of political ideology is. We can discuss it and we can talk about how to discourage it, but murder is murder.
Isn't it the idea, regardless of whether you think there should be kind of a hate crime legislation that ups the sentencing or anything like that for, depending on what motivated the crime, the same way that there is legislation that makes your penalty higher if you murder a police officer or a judge or things like that, regardless of whether or not you think that kind of victim-specific change should be in effect. To understand and prevent any kind of crime, it seems clear to me that you should investigate the motivations of it. If we're talking about kind of the prevalence of violence against women, we should talk about why it is that people are vulnerable in specific situations. If we want to talk about the high prevalence of, partner violence among police officers, we should talk about what cultural factors exist in those kinds of communities that are resulting in that outcome. And I think that we don't do a very good job as a country, particularly in certain, I would say, conservative media spheres, talking about the very existence of racism. The word white supremacy is kind of persona non grata in these spaces. There's a lot of people questioning whether the thing even exists. And I think that is troubling if you want to be able to predict these kind of incidents and cut them off at the pass, not to mention the rise in anti-Asian violence that we've seen over the past year. How can you start to address that if there's absolutely no interrogation of what the cause and effect here may be?
Well, I think it's really clear that the cause is amped up rhetoric, right? So anytime you amp up rhetoric against a group and you say this group is bad because of XYZ reason, you're going to eventually get a madman who's just a crazy person. I mean, look, this person, yes, do I think that he had some sort of, I read his so-called manifesto, whatever you want to call it. It was just like it didn't make any sense. It was 180 pages of nonsense, quite frankly. And, of course you could parse through all that and say, wow, well, this person believed this thing or this person believed that thing. It was really clear that this person was insane. So you've got an insane person who then is latched on to some sort of ideology, and they're now, but a year prior to that, he was going to go shoot up his school. It had nothing to do with race. It was something else because he's crazy. He's a madman. So I think that you can also do the same sort of thing with hate crimes against Asian Americans, where we're seeing people walking around and punching grandmas in the face. Well, this person is obviously a crazy person, and then they're taking ramped up rhetoric and they're running with it, but they're fundamentally insane. And I know people want to, what I'm seeing a lot of right now is people saying, well, no, we shouldn't just call these people crazy. We need to call it what it is. And this is white supremacy. No, this person was crazy who happened to latch on to a radical ideology that it didn't make, the radical ideology didn't make him crazy. He's clearly crazy before he latched onto this radical ideology. And I think you could do the same sort of thing with any sort of radical hatred towards a group. One thing that we're seeing also, ramped up rhetoric against right-wing America, right? So there's a lot of talk against conservatives, calling everybody on the right Nazis. Well, that is also hate speech. So when we see something happen, when we see a hate crime against conservatives are we going to call that rhetoric out as well and say, well, when you're telling people, when you're telling your audience that everybody on that watches Tucker Carlson is essentially a right-wing Nazi, and that Nazis are dangerous and Nazis should be stopped, and then somebody actually does it, are we gonna also ascribe blame where that belongs as well to
Kim,
CNN?
If there are people who are saying that everyone who goes on Tucker Carlson are Nazis, and subsequently a Nazi, someone kills 10 of those people as a consequence of that kind of rhetoric, I think that there should be a conversation about whether blame lies there. But I do think it feels a little untoward in the context of all of these people being hunted down and targeted because explicitly they're Black Americans with a gun that says, here's your reparations, and not be willing to take even a moment to have a conversation about the specific ideology that motivated this outcome. Because what we aren't seeing is people who are ideologically motivated to have mass killings of white people on the basis of their being white. And thank God that we're not seeing that yet. We are seeing, when we're talking about Nazis, a conversation that some folks on the left and on the right are trying to have about whether or not our military aid is going to fund Nazis overseas. And I do think that you're right that there is a certain degree of heightened rhetoric that is overcharging conservatives with what they can appropriately be pegged with. And I've talked about this on my show recently, that part of the lack of credibility that liberals have in having these conversations is that some of the language has been poorly targeted to what is actually being said, and they basically tried to peg conservatives like Tucker Carlson with more than they can prove. But there's also plenty that can be proven there in terms of how much he has emphasized the replacement theory, which definitely was a motivator in this case. And even if this act of violence would have happened somewhere eventually because this person is crazy, I think it is pretty meaningful to the people who were killed because they were Black that ultimately it was their Blackness that got them murdered and the people who were not killed injured.
Well, we do have, Robby, did you want to jump in there? Or are we going to move on to?
I was gonna go off on a tangent. So did you guys see that? I think this is worth discussing. I saw the Associated Press tweet that we should not, and we all have done it today. They said, do not call it a manifesto. You're supposed to call it a racist diatribe, which I found very odd, because manifesto I don't think has a positive connotation. Have you ever say you should read so-and-so's manifesto? That's not a glorifying or complimentary thing to say, but this was a claim from the Associated Press that it's like glamorizing him to describe it as a manifesto that I thought was very weird and totally wrong, and like another example of I don't know, trying to change language to show more sensitivity when the language we have is perfectly adequate. You guys didn't see that? They tweeted it yesterday. That was very odd.
I didn't see it, but I actually agree not to use the word. I mean, even though I've been using the word manifesto, not to use the word manifesto, but not for those same reasons. I would say don't use the word manifesto because manifesto implies that there was some real serious political ideology driving this madman. But this person was clearly crazy. And when you read that document, it didn't make any sense. It was all over the place. It contradicted itself over and over. It was written in question answer form. It was very bizarre. So it wasn't really a manifesto like this guy is rallying up the troops, even though in his deranged mind he thought he was. But it wasn't really what I would say is like a document that now is expressing a political ideology that is growing in any sort of momentum. I just don't think this is growing in any momentum. I do, and I understand your point, Briahna, that maybe great replacement theory is being talked about more and more by both the left and the right. Many people on the left said, yeah, that's right. But I also don't think it's really necessary. I mean, I don't know. This is kind of a strange place to be in when people are talking about it like it's a theory. I thought it was actually a pretty known fact that white people are not actually breeding at a rate that would allow white people to remain dominant on the planet. But that's so. I thought that this was like a scientific fact.
Well, the
color of the globe is changing.
Yes, that's absolutely true. That white people will constitute a smaller proportion of people in America, given birth rates and immigration
in the world.
Sure, theory, the great replacement theory, specifically says, and that is deliberate on the part of Jewish overlords in order to weaken, in the American context, in order to harm Republican Party values, the European culture, capitalism, et cetera, which are religion, Christianity, all of those things. I was saying in an earlier segment, certainly that doesn't add up because it's not part of a Jewish cabal doing it. Right. Also, a lot of the immigrants coming to America, immigrants do not have a unanimity of views on these subjects. There are even if you're operating from the standpoint of one must preserve white conservative values or something. Well, there's a lot of white people in America who are like arch liberal progressive, and there are a lot of immigrants coming in who are more religious and not on board with that kind of stuff. So I think that even if you were trying to make the best case for the theory and like lose the conspiratorial stuff, I don't think it even passes.
When you say the worst thing that happened to the country was an immigration act that changed the demographic, not the political, but the demographic valence of the country in the 1960s. And when you're talking about the value of legacy Americans and trying to keep their numbers up when the country was founded with a 20% black population, and they're kind of absent from the discourse, it kind of gives the game away about whether or not you're actually concerned about cultural shifts or whether you're concerned about racial shifts, even though I think people are doing a pretty good job of not having an explicitly racialized rhetoric on TV, at least.
Yeah.
Well, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked by Fox News' Peter Doocy why Biden didn't visit Waukesha, Wisconsin, after the fatal attack by a driver who ran through a Christmas parade. Let's watch that.
And then just one on the trip tomorrow. How come the president is visiting Buffalo after a senseless tragedy there, but he couldn't visit Waukesha after 6 were killed and 61 injured in an attack on a Christmas parade there?
I mean, he's visited many communities. Buffalo, he's able to go tomorrow to Buffalo before the trip. That is something that was important for him to do. But he has visited many other communities. Buffalo's not the first community, sadly, that he has to go up to because of a violent attack. So, that's not the first one. So he's been to many others.
I guess, right, the technical answer is there was something else on the schedule probably, which maybe is not satisfying to people. You weren't going to get an interesting response there no matter what.
I do think that, look, this particular kind of question, it's so difficult to figure out whether or not there was actually some kind of preference being demonstrated, because the schedules are, I remember, Bernie Sanders getting in trouble for these kinds of things all the time, and it was always just a scheduling issue. And I know it's really unsatisfactory for the public, and obviously schedules get changed when there is something that's a significantly high priority or you're going to take a significantly big political hit. So that does play a role. But, I have no interest here in covering for Biden in any circumstances, but it's just so difficult to know here that it's not just what happens to work out, that I have a hard time getting frustrated by it.
Yeah. Similarly, me as well. So we also have some updates on the church shooting in California that we wanted to get to. Authorities have confirmed the attack was motivated by political hatred against Taiwan. Mostly Taiwanese parishioners attended the church. The alleged gunman's hatred toward Taiwan was documented in handwritten notes that authorities found. So a hate crime investigation ongoing there as well. This was an older man who thought Taiwan should remain part of China, from reporting I looked at in the LA Times, which is interesting. What do you think, Kim?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like the motivation was, is that this is, for whatever reason, and again, in his deranged mind, believed that, so he's from mainland China, I am assuming, right. And these parishioners were from Taiwan, and he was taking out his political angst about Taiwan and China relations on these parishioners. Although I guess it could be that he was also Taiwanese. I guess that's a possibility. I'm not 100% certain.
But doesn't it? Here's where it starts to break down, right? In terms of what the media narrative is about the rise of hate and right-wing hate. Like there was all this reporting previously on how, or claims actually, some of the reporting did not bear it out, that hate is rising, right-wing extremism rising. Trump's rhetoric has emboldened it. And after the was it massage parlor killing last year? that was, described as anti-Asian violence because all the victims, most of the victims were Asian. But of course, if you, again, try to understand that crazy person's motivation, it seemed actually more targeted at sex workers. They just happened to be Asian. But so in this case, here's anti-Asian violence, and if you had just told someone, in the wake of that attack a year ago, you say, there was a shooting at and Asian people were killed or shot at. Right? They would say, look at what anti-Asian Trump, the Kung flu kind of rhetoric has unleashed. Well, actually, it was a pro-Chinese nationalism kind of person doing it, which is like the opposite of that. So the reality sometimes, the reality does fit. The narratives are not always wrong. You can draw, I think, in the Buffalo shooting a much clearer line between some really awful language about immigrants and non-white people and this kind of thing. But there's so much violence in this country. It's terrible, and it just does not all fit with what you would expect or what is being talked about by the media. Some of it is just totally non-political. A lot of it, most of it, vast majority, totally non-political. And I think it's important to always keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, tomorrow on Rising, Hill reporter Julia Manchester will be here to break down the results so far from Tuesday's primary contests.
And we'll be talking about President Biden's decision to approve a plan to redeploy troops to Somalia.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you tomorrow.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.